HDR images have gained in popularity recently as photographers explore ways of capturing more detail through multiple exposures than their camera can do in a single shot. In CS5, the HDR tool has gotten a makeover that makes creating these composite images very straightforward. In this lesson, we'll also see how to mimic the HDR look using just a single image. Now, to merge HDR images, we need to go up to the File menu, down to Automate, and choose Merge to HDR Pro. That brings up a dialog box where we choose our source files. What I want you to do is hit the Browse button, navigate to your Chapter 6 folder, and we're going to select all of these files titled HDR EXP. So I'm simply going to click the first file and shift click on the last one here and hit Open. Now we've got an option at the bottom to automatically align these source images. I'm going to turn this off because these images were all shot on a tripod. If in the future you're using handheld images, definitely check this box. It's going to make the results much more professional. We'll simply hit OK. And now we have our Merge to HDR Pro dialog box. A couple of things I want to point out here. One, these images are all RAW files. They're actually in the DNG format. And far and away, you're going to achieve the best results if you're bringing in RAW files. And if you're starting with a RAW file, don't convert them to TIFFs or PSDs or JPEGs and then bring them into HDR Pro. Point HDR Pro directly to the RAW files. It will open those up through Photoshop. The second thing I'd like to note is that, especially in the initial loading sequence that we just finished, and later on when we actually create the composite file, this operation takes quite a bit of computing power. So if you've got an older machine, this may take a while. So just be patient. Now in our dialog box, this is completely revamped from CS4. So let's take a look at what we've got here. At the top, we've got a list of presets. Now this gives you a lot of sort of standard looks, things that you can use either as is or use them as a jumping point to build your own renditions of the file. We're going to leave our settings here at default because we're going to go through each of these sliders one by one. Now there is a new feature here called Remove Ghosts, and this is very important. If you're shooting a series of images that include people in them or other objects that are moving, it could be birds in the sky, anything moving across your frame, Remove Ghosts will match content from a base image and eliminate any other elements that don't match that. I'm going to turn on Remove Ghosts here. Now we don't have any people or animals in this scene, but if you notice this cloud area up in here, the wind wasn't that strong, but the clouds were moving. So watch what will happen. You see this little magenta cast right here along the edge. This is happening because the clouds were in different positions over the different exposures. And simply by clicking Remove Ghosts, Photoshop will process these files, base everything off of a source image, and now we've got a much more seamless blend in the sky. Now, which image is Photoshop using to determine whether objects have shifted or not? Well, it's this image here, selected with the green border. And you can move this to any image that you want. Simply click another image, that border will become green, and that image will be used as the base to eliminate objects that exist in one frame and not another. We're going to work in 16-bit mode here. Choosing 32-bit will retain all the information here, but to be honest, right now there's not a whole lot you can do in terms of output with a 32-bit image. That contains a dynamic range that you can't even really display on your monitor. So we're going to set this to 16-bit. And this menu here has 4 different choices to work in. We're going to choose local adaptation because that gives us the most flexibility. It gives us access to the greatest number of controls for the image. The other 3 have a bunch of automatic settings. Now the first thing I want to talk about here, I'm going to skip Edge Glow for a moment and go down into Tone and Detail. The first thing we want to look at here is the exposure slider. And this does really what it sounds like it would do. It adjusts the overall exposure. So if you feel that the image needs an exposure boost, drag it to the right. That lightens it up a bit. You want to take care not to overdo it with the exposure, but you want to just get something that feels pretty good. Next, let's jump down here to our highlights. And now we're going to specifically control the range of highlights in the image. I'm going to click here and drag my highlight slider to the left because I want to keep as much detail in the sky as possible. So I'll bring it down somewhere about here. Looks pretty good. That way we can get some nice detail down in here. And we're going to do the same with shadows. Now the shadows here are very open, so I'm going to take my shadow slider and drag this pretty aggressively down to the left, over here in the 60s somewhere. Like that looks pretty good. So now we've got nice shadows down in here and in the door. And now let's take a look at the gamma slider. You can think of this as a contrast slider here. If we drag it to the right, you can see that we greatly decrease the amount of contrast in the image, and we start to get that HDR surreal kind of look that you see so often. We're going to go for a more photorealistic result here, so I'm going to actually drag the gamma slider to the left and add some more contrast. Now we have something that looks much more photographic. We've got a detail slider here, and again, if we take this all the way to the left, we do get that real sort of soft focus, dreamy kind of effect. Again, what we're going for is a much more photorealistic effect. So I'm actually going to boost detail a bit right up in here. Now you don't want to overdo it because the image can quickly get very, very crunchy and overly stylized. So 74% looks pretty good. I wouldn't go beyond that for this particular image. Now let's talk about edge glow. We've got a radius and a strength. Now this is controlling areas of local brightness. And the radius is going to determine how far those areas spread. The strength determines the point at which Photoshop identifies neighboring pixels as having a similar level of brightness. So what we're going to do here is come down a bit on the radius. Maybe go about there. And strength, we can also bring that down just a bit. Again, we're trying for just a very natural, realistic result. If you move both of these sliders to the right, then you're far off into super duper hyper realistic land, and this image we want to keep as a photographic image, so I'm going to be very conservative here with these sliders. Now we've got vibrance and saturation controls here, and much like in Photoshop proper, vibrance is an intelligent saturation. When you move saturation, all of the colors are shifted by the same amount. With vibrance, however, colors that already are starting with more saturation are shifted less than colors that are beginning with less saturation. So it gives you a much gentler, much more believable result. So while we can leave saturation here at the default, maybe we'll pull back on it a bit here. Where we really want to do our work is with this vibrant slider. So watch the green and the blue of the sky and the green in the foliage. If we come up here, now we've got some nice saturation going on here, but we're not clipping any colors. The last thing I want to show you here, if we click on this curve tab, is we have a tone curve to work with. Now if you find that these tone and detail sliders don't quite give you the precision or granularity that you're looking for, this is where you want to go. What we can do here is work on a curve in a similar fashion than we can inside the Photoshop Curves adjustment layer. Unlike in the Curves dialog box, though, there's no on-image adjustment tool, so we're going to have to manually click and drag here. What I want to do, perhaps, is add a bit more contrast to this image. What I'm going to do is click and place a point down here in the shadows, somewhere like that. But I don't want my highlights to get darker, so I'm going to put a point here on the highlight region, bring this back roughly where it was originally, and what I'd like to do with the midtones is maybe open those up a bit. So I'm going to click here and just drag up a bit, just making a slight S curve. That looks pretty good. We just have a nice range of contrast in the scene, and there we have our preview of what our composite HDR image is going to look like. We'll simply hit OK, and Photoshop will get to work creating a file that is combining the exposure of all of these individual images. And there we have it, our HDR image converted to a 16-bit per channel file and looking pretty good. Now, what about if we don't have multiple exposures, we just have a single image? We can achieve the sort of stylized HDR look very simply. Let's go back to our Chapter 6 folder, and let's scroll down here and open up the file HDR toning. What we want to do with this single image is emulate the HDR look that normally we would have to get by merging multiple images together. To do that, we go up to the Image menu, under Adjustments, and we select HDR Toning. This is brand new to CS5. Now this dialog box should look very familiar. It's got the identical controls that we just saw in HDR Pro. The difference being this time we can apply them to a single image. And now we are going to take a look at some of the presets here. We've got a bunch of black and white presets here. We've got monochromatic, artistic, and you'll see that with these presets you're really getting some highly stylized and creative results, far removed from how the original image looks. We've got photorealistic, high contrast, and so on, and we've even got surrealistic options down here. Now, of course, whichever preset we choose, we're free to modify it. We're going to go back to the presets here, and I'm going to start with more saturated. This is going to really give us something that you really come across on sites like Flickr. If you go and type in HDR, this is really the kind of style that you're seeing for these type of images. So we'll start here. And it looks fairly good. The only things I would do here is maybe come down just a bit on the saturation. Just a bit right there. We could maybe bring our shadows down a little bit heavier. You can see we've got this super duper hyper realistic effect full of colors that don't exist in nature but that will make you very popular on photo sharing sites. Again, we could adjust the exposure just a bit here. Maybe I'll come down just a touch there, and the gamma here, let's just bring this down a bit. You've got all of these options here to work with, including the tone curve down here at the bottom. So in this case, with a single channel image, these presets are great. They can really get you to a good starting point when you're trying to achieve a very stylized result. If you're happy with these results, simply hit OK. And you've now got a faux